So please, when you're back, would you turn on your camera, give me a smile, give us a wave, give us an emoji. Great, we're all still here. I see some snacks going on. I see some coffee. We're on to the final part of our day. I hope you're all feeling refreshed from your body break and from the films. It's wonderful to see those two from Somalia, Somaliland. All these films will be available for you to watch. So we're just giving a bit of a taster throughout the conference. So moving on to our final session, I'm very pleased to welcome our next two hubs to present. Today, we are going to be hearing from Somalia, Somaliland, from Amal. Hi, Amal, do you want to just give a wave? Hi. She's going to be presenting first. And then secondly, we'll be hearing from Hayla and Gamu and Gary. Hi there. So you'll be going second. Thanks so much, Mickey. So without further ado, we're going to stop screen share there. I'm going to hand over to Amal. So without further ado, big round of applause for Amal. Give her an emoji, give her a clap. Thanks, Amal. The floor is yours.
Hi all, thank you. My name's Amal. I am the postdoctoral researcher at Transparency Solutions and for the Somaliland hub. And I'd like to share with you some of our findings with regards to the research project that we all took part in the last couple of years. So just to give you a little bit of the context, as you can see on the slide there are sort of three different regions. We've got Somaliland, which declared independence from Somalia in the early 90s. We have Puntland and we have Somalia. And so we've had 15 research projects which took part across the whole of the Horn of Africa. And it's called the Horn because it looks a little bit like a trumpet, I think. So when you hear me refer to the Horn of Africa, it's the whole region. It's this whole sort of East African region. And if you hear me refer to Somaliland or Puntland or Somalia, it's the individual sort of regions. So let me start giving you sort of the research context. So in the context of the Horn of Africa, we have an extremely young population with about 80% of people being under the age of 35. We have high rates of unemployment, mainly due to the fact that it is sort of a post-conflict society. When we look at climate change, I think it's really important to understand that the environment in this part of the world has been extremely degraded. No, that's not right. Degraded. Maybe that is right. Firstly, because of having this post-conflict society, it's also because Somaliland doesn't have a fully functioning or fully recognized government, and Somalia has severely, really weak institutions. There's lack of adequate law enforcement, and it's fully been affected by sort of the global processes of climate change. So there are lots of different vulnerable groups who've been represented in all our projects, whether that's women or youth or minority clans, because we do have a clan-based system, disabled populations. We have internally displaced people, displaced predominantly due to climate change and climate action, due to desertification in the region. The majorities of Somalis live in rural areas. We are predominantly nomadic pastoralists, although there are a few farmers. And the share of rural Somalis without formal education is 1.6 times higher than that of urban residents, and 2.5 or 2.6 times higher for nomads and IDPs, respectively. And we will touch on sort of vulnerabilities later on in the project, but I think it's important to fully understand the research context before I talk about the research that took place. Usually marginalized groups are marginalized in more than one sort of identity group, and we'll talk about that in more detail as the project, as the presentation continues. So we have 15 projects which looked at a range of different things. Which looks at a range of different things, whether it's formal education, informal education, or community education, whether it's TVETs. We had 3 or 4 universities, but the majority of our projects took place in sort of the informal or the community space. And so we've had a number of concerns prior to actually starting the research projects. First and foremostly, it's, how do we manage these projects democratically? How do we negotiate these power relations? How do we amplify marginalized voices? Who will benefit from this collaboration? We are so used to this part of the world for Western universities to kind of come to Somaliland or Somalia, do the work, undertake the research, and then go away. Whether it's universities, whether it's NGOs, it has never been truly an equal relationship. And so when we were putting out the call for papers, the first concern that we had is, right, how do we manage these projects democratically, especially considering that there are regions who don't speak to each other, there's different people from different communities, and the fact that we are in a post-conflict society. And I'll talk on how we sort of solved these, not solved, but how we sort of had these conversations within the team and within our projects. We had a number of cross-cutting themes. We started off with the original sort of TESF themes, so education on sustainable livelihoods, education for climate and environmental action, education and sustainable cities, addressing social inequalities and decolonizing research and foregrounding marginalized voices. But other themes emerged as the project sort of went on. For example, community education for sustainable futures, democratization of knowledge, problematizing gender and gender expectations, equitable community partnerships, not just in terms of Bristol, the Somali Hub and the projects, but also between the projects, within the projects, this concept of collective agencies. How do we operationalize indigenous knowledge systems, because obviously these had to be critiqued and tackled and transformed to a certain extent. Skills and competencies for employability, and most importantly, sustainability. What can we do to ensure that the projects will continue long after, or the projects or the work continues long after the project and the funding has run out, in order for it to sort of feel like an equal or an equitable partnership. So in order for the projects to be truly democratic, we had to work in a very unique way. Due to the Somali Hub's unique political situation, in the sense that Somaliland declared independence from Somalia in the early 90s, these two political spaces don't speak to one another. And there's a lot of sort of clan conflict and a lot of sort of power dynamic in that region. So we had to think quite innovatively in order to ensure that there is democratization of knowledge, and sort of to think critically about this concept of ethics of engagement. In order to kind of ensure that all the projects included some elements of co-production, and actually all projects did have some form of co-production, we had to actively create this bottom-up feedback mechanism across the regions they worked in, or across all the regions that we work in order to kind of share information and to synthesize data across from these projects. So we had to appoint regional leads from the 3 different regions. We had the regional lead for Somaliland, a regional lead for Puntland, and a regional lead for South Central. In order to ensure that projects could speak openly to their regional leaders who understand the local context and could kind of speak in the local dialect, because the 3 regional leads, who also worked as research associates for the hub, were indigenous to that part of Somalia, Puntland, or Somaliland. And so they were sort of, when we think of this concept, insider, outsiders, insiders, they would then feed the information up to the hub lead and to the postdoctoral researcher, and information would go up that way and it would kind of go down that way. So as a result of this bottom-up feedback approach and the fact that almost all the projects engaged entirely in Somali, all the research projects were actively engaged in the proposal, formulation, implementation, and dissemination of their research project, which, as I said, predominantly took place in the Somali language within their own sort of regional dialects. This also allowed the hub to create safe spaces for the relevant communities, especially since there is sort of clan conflict in this part of the world, by ensuring that there was a native from that community who could empower those projects and ensure that their voices were accurately translated in their reports and subsequently in our hub reports. And the structure also allowed the projects to kind of give a counter narrative using their indigenous knowledge and scholarship, which at times did conflict with the scholarship on the area. And we felt that that kind of fit into our kind of our decolonial framework. Co-production meant that across all the projects, all 15 projects, those who were meant to benefit participated in design, implementation, dissemination, and evaluation of the research. And in turn, this led to sort of processes of social change, which I'll talk about transformation later on in my presentation. Participation also differed that in some projects, the object that was, or the knowledge that was being co-created was very different. So some projects, it's co-creation of a curriculum for minority workers or informal traders that would allow them to build on their sort of employability skills. In others, it was simply through conversations and the sharing of experience of either teachers or government workers or pastoralist farmers. Co-production allowed us to be inclusive and an instrument of positive social change. For example, it became a means for members of a deaf community to take a direct role in a project that was about improving their employment project. So in this project SO09, the deaf community co-created a booklet that was entitled, Being Deaf Didn't Stop Me From Working. And it sort of highlighted members of the deaf communities that had specific jobs. And it was then passed on to the local business owners who in turn were it was a showcase of their ability. And it led not only to their direct employment or the direct employment of some of the members, but also it was discovered that the line ministry, so the employment ministry, the labor ministry, had a particular office meant for the empowerment of marginalized communities or disabled communities it was. And so they then engaged with them in order to include them in any future policy work regarding employment and disabled community. And in order to be, for co-production to be effective, the majority of projects were carried out in the indigenous Somali language. So co-production allowed us to ensure participation by people in social categories that experience social exclusion in terms of representation, resources, rights, and their voice in their society due to, for example, illiteracy, high proportion of high proportion of the researchers within the projects were actual illiterate, but that didn't stop them from taking part in the co-production. Gender, being a youth, being a member of a minority clan or minority ethnic group, or being a low-caste worker, a rural pastoralist, informal small trader, internally displaced person or refugee. In this way, we were able to move beyond research for the underprivileged that argues against inequality. Instead, the research process became a process of social change by reducing inequality in its own activities. The researchers were treated not as passive beneficiaries, but as active agents of change. And once again, we'll talk about transformation in sort of the next session. It did mean that we had to create certain adaptations. For example, we had to obtain consent orally, which is suited to more oral cultures and to those who are not literate. We were also materials, including the draft report, and pitching it to the individual's level of understanding. And in the context of one of our projects that dealt with nomadic pastoralists, as they were creating knowledge under a tree, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, they were recorded, transcribed, and then read back to them in Somali to ensure that the information captured accurately reflected their views. And so through this process, we were able to kind of decenter the research, because it was research for the projects, by the projects, with wider implications. There were a few thematic frameworks that we kind of had to look at. For example, poverty and economic inequality. The Horn of Africa is, I think it's currently the 4th or the 5th poorest country in the world, or Somalia as a whole is considered the 4th poorest country in the world. Yet there's still very little research rooted in the Somali context, which explores the intersections of economic deprivation and educational inequality, which we did touch upon. And then also sort of the research context, because during the course of us undertaking our research, the Horn of Africa endured catastrophic locust infestations, extreme weather events in the form of recurring droughts. We're on the verge of a famine, according to the IPC. And then we had flooding in our southern and eastern regions. We had COVID, which also led to an economic contraction of approximately 1.5%. So there is extreme poverty in this part of the world. We also looked at projects that all the projects dealt in one way or another with clan inequality, but Project SO01 particularly did. It was a project that looked at the creation of a curriculum to teach minority communities how to read and write. So we'll talk about that. We also had projects that dealt with or that examined social and gender inequality. And I'm sure some of you saw Asma's video. So while enrollment in schools and access to education is low across all social groups, inequalities in educational opportunities are most profound for women and girls, internally displaced persons, and for individuals from rural, pastoralist, and nomadic communities. For those whose identities recounted by more than one of these social descriptors, the impacts on education and equality of opportunities tend to get further compounded. So in the case of Project SO14, these girls who were encouraged to kind of play basketball and to reflect on that all were internally displaced persons. There are people who lived in rural, who were part of the rural pastoralist and nomadic communities, and then were kind of forced to come into the cities due to extreme environmental degradation. In the context of the Somali-speaking world, it's a very patriarchal society. The idea of women exercising out in public is extremely frowned upon. So the fact that we had a project that kind of looked at the effect of sports and playing basketball on sort of the morale and emotional well-being of these young women was profoundly sort of empowering. So all projects found that inequalities in education affect every aspect of life and is often exacerbated by other intersectional factors, whether it's poverty, gender inequality, clan inequality, disability, geographical locations, so sort of rural, urban, and or minority status. It's also important to note that our education system is extremely fragmented. It's most likely as a result of its problematic colonial legacies. Somalia was colonized by Italy. Somaliland was colonized by the UK. So it's common for the education systems in Somalia to reflect the education systems of sort of Italy, and for Somaliland to reflect the education systems of the United Kingdom. But because of sort of the free market and so on and so forth, there are other education systems. So the Middle East and that of sort of Kenya in more recent years, with sort of the proliferation of more private private sort of schools and universities. So there is currently very little general and statistical information about disability in the whole of the Somali region. Although it's estimated that the population includes thousands of disabled adults and children for whom there is very minimal recognition and provision. Disabilities can occur from a lack of access to prenatal, birth, and postnatal injury health services. There's little access to sort of vaccination programs, especially for sort of polio, burns, and then there's also burns and fractures, which can lead to orthopedic problems, sensory disability, and then also sort of the kind of disabilities that comes with being a post conflict society, so landmines and other war injuries and amputations. Now, SO09 had a very poignant quote within the sort of project report, which discussed a gentleman who kind of, despite the barriers to education, was able to kind of progress from primary to secondary to university education. And then after they graduated university, were unable to get a job due to sort of discriminatory work practices, and it sort of plunged them into depression and mental health problems. And I think, you know, having this project which empowered the deaf community and allowed them to be employed within mostly the private sector, and to bring them to the attention of the government, I think was very important. And I think it's because one thing that I think the project was able to do was to become a bridge between the policy sphere and marginalized community. So this is a very famous bridge in Hargeisa that takes you into the city center and to Wahin Market, which is a very famous market in the city that burnt down recently. One of the things that we did as a team is go back to is to engage with our projects and to kind of ask them what transformation, what impact have you seen since the research took place. One of which is, I'm sure some of you saw the video created by John Samanya on Green Garowe. The local municipality passed a policy that said the city is not allowed to build more roads unless they've made provisions for trees, so that for every road built, we need to plant trees. I'll be 1 second, Rosie. I'm coming to the end of my time. So that's one sort of transformation that we had. We were able to kind of reach the policy sphere by being that bridge between marginalized communities and the policy sphere. And then also similarly with the deaf communities and the Line Ministry, there's also community transformation. So the creation of eco schools, which engage with the local community, engaging NGOs in schools and allowing them to pool their resources together. We also had the water project. Through the selling of water, one of our schools was able to provide free education to their local community. And in terms of sort of, and we were also in some of our other projects able to sort of problematize gender and the gender expectations of young women. There's personal transformation. We have 76 minority workers co-creating a literacy and numeracy curriculum, subsequently learn how to read and write, which of course transformed their worldview. Some of them were then able to teach their children how to read and write, which also transformed their children's worldview, which is something I'm really proud about. Informal traders in Hargeisa were able to co-create a curriculum for literacy and numeracy, and they requested digital education so they could use mobile money, which then allowed them to sort of scale up their businesses, which led to their sustainable livelihoods. And then I think this might be the one that I'm most proud of, and I'll try and keep it within a minute. The projects were able to contribute and transform indigenous knowledge systems. So within the context of the Somali-speaking world, knowledge is often created. In fact, laws are created under the tree. So if you look on the picture on the right, you see a group of people under a tree. The fact that women are sitting under that is extremely transformative, because normally they are excluded from the creation of laws and rules and social norms, but they are sat there to eliminate a harmful practice. If you look on your left, you can see that trees and shrubberies have been used to create sort of livestock enclosures, and it was found that by the cutting of trees and shrubs in an area that's already like within the process of desertification, it then led to further desertification and soil erosion. So one of our projects was able to kind of sit with nomadic pastoralists and talk about, well, what can we do instead of this harmful cultural practice? What can we do instead to kind of continue our cultural indigenous ways of life, but to do so in a way that's sustainable? So we're able to transform indigenous knowledge systems and to kind of critique the fact that just because it's something that's been done for generations does not mean that it is essentially a good thing. We can sit together and through the traditional ways of producing knowledge, amend traditional ways of doing things. So in conclusion, some of the findings that we had was, in order to transform education for sustainable futures, we need to look beyond formal education systems. Our projects reflected the region, which is that the majority of individuals are outside the formal education systems and actually learn things through sort of the community space. It's also important to create linkages between schools, policymakers, teachers, the community stakeholders, local NGOs, to allow for the sharing of resources, especially in a space where resources are scarce, and to come up with innovative solutions to local problems. And, you know, the need to operationalize indigenous knowledge systems in formal and informal learning spaces, and to also critique them and unpack them. And I will stop there so that we can have sort of questions and answers. Thank you very much, and thank you for allowing me to give this presentation.
A big congratulations to Amal for presenting on behalf of more than just herself, of her team. So please use an emoji and put your camera on just to show your appreciation. Thanks so much. We're not finished with Somalia yet, because we're going to go into Q&A. I'm not going to check the chat just now. I know there's some questions in there. So first we're going to run a poll, as we did yesterday. Question 1. What are the top three things that sparked? Yes, we found that too. Question 2, which 3 things do you feel no, that doesn't apply to our project? And 3, what would you like to add based on your project experience? So again, this is from the presentation that you've just heard, which is Somalia, Somaliland.
Yes, thank you, Amal. It's a really excellent presentation, very coherent, and you put it so beautifully, and I find a lot of resonance with our project as well. Yeah, it seems there's a consensus that's developing around the importance of marginalized voices, and to the co-creation methodology as the way forward. Have you discovered any kind of barriers, and how do we make sure that, now that we know it's important, that if the marginalized voices are not there, it's not full knowledge, how do we address the barriers? How do we address the obstacles? Have you explored any of that?
Go ahead, Amal. We'll take one question.
You are muted, Amal.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, we have discovered barriers. One of the ways in which we kind of try to overcome our barriers is from the very beginning, is when people do, or when groups do research on Somali communities, they tend to move them from their indigenous spaces into the urban areas for the research to take place. One of the things that we actively worked on in order to create that sort of equitable partnership is to go to each of the communities and to kind of deal with them or engage with them in a way that is sort of socially acceptable for that community. So I'm glad Jama told me that I muted, because one of the things that he did is every time he went out to the nomadic pastoralists, he literally sat under the tree that you saw in my presentation, and he slaughtered, I think it's usually a goat. Am I right, John? It's a goat. They'd slaughter a goat and they'd feed the community. And once the community had been fed, that's when they'd sit down and they'd have, the co-production would kind of take place, and they'd have these conversations about, the actual research questions that's been co-produced. The only time in which a project did not go out to the communities in a space, in their own personal space, is in the context of the minority workers, because minority workers are so sort of excluded and are so marginalized. They chose to have their events and to have their sort of capacity exercises to take place in like a 5-star hotel in order to motivate them, but also to empower them to feel like, those spaces are for everyone. But yeah, we have discovered barriers, but we knew very early on through the conversations and through the co-production processes how to kind of deal with, how to kind of overcome those barriers, because the groups that we were co-producing research with were actors in the research project from the very beginning. I hope I answered your question there.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Amal. We have another question. We've got just a couple more minutes to go. So we've got one more question from the floor. I'm going to read it out from the chat. Thanks, Raphael. Can you explain the ways in which existing or traditional spaces are changed, adapted slightly to make them more equitable in the context of collaborative research and action?
Excellent. So one of the things that we did across all projects is to set ground rules. And so if we invited the community, it was very important for the communities that we invited to be diverse. And so this idea of including women in sort of decision making, or including women within the research is very alien. But once we set ground rules whereby we said these are red lines and we will not cross them, and anything else, we can adapt and we can change, except in the context of one of our projects, and it's the basketball project, where the young women and the girls asked that it be a women-only safe space. So in that context, we said, that's fine. We will create sort of a safe space. But right from the very beginning, based on sort of, the rules of engagement and the rules of ethics, we set out clear red lines. And it is problematic because of our problematic colonial history. Somalis as a people are very anti-change, and they're very anti anything that they feel comes from outside and changes their way of life. So one of the things that some of our project leads did in order to adopt or adapt traditional spaces is to ground it in local ethics, local ethical practices, local, traditions that upheld these concepts of equality and respecting human rights and human dignity and the environment. And by making sustainability a local issue rather than an outside issue that comes in, we were then also able to kind of tie it to the ground rules that we set out right at the start of each research project. And so, yeah, that's how we adapted existing traditional spaces in a way to make them more equitable.
Wonderful. Thanks, Amal. And I see Raphael has posted a thank you in the chat, and there's some other comments. We'll save these for you and share them with you as well. So with that, we're just going to give Amal a very big round of applause. Thank you so much. What a very fascinating and insightful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.
And also to your team. I know you might want to thank your team as well.
Yes, of course. Round of applause to the team as well, because it's not the Amal show.